When you flick a light switch, you probably don't spend much time thinking about the source of the electricity.
Right?
And if that source is a nuclear power plant, well, the journey of that energy starts with something pretty fascinating,
Mm-hmm.
but often overlooked. The fuel itself.
Mm-hmm.
Where does it come from? And how does it get ready to power millions of homes? It can feel like a really complex puzzle, maybe.
It can seem that way.
But just like understanding the journey of coffee beans from a farm to your cup makes that morning brew more interesting, getting a handle on the nuclear fuel cycle can really, demystify the whole process.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're diving into today.
Okay.
Our focus is on modern uranium mining and the nuclear fuel cycle, essentially. Everything that happens before the fill even gets to the reactor.
Right, the fun end.
We've got some really informative material to explore. First, a detailed report from the Nuclear Energy Agency that gives us a comprehensive look at how uranium is mined today.
Okay, good source.
Then we'll dig into a review from Idaho National Laboratory that covers the different types of nuclear fuels and the technologies used if we want to reprocess them.
Reprocessing. Okay.
And finally, we'll look at a Government Accountability Office report, a GAO report that examines the ins and outs of the uranium supply chain here in the U.S.
So our goal today is to give you a clear and engaging picture of where nuclear fuel comes from, the steps it goes through to become usable, and some of the key things to consider along the way.
Yeah.
We're aiming to make this understandable and interesting, so we'll try and avoid getting bogged down in overly technical details.
Absolutely. Keep it accessible.
Okay, let's get started at the very beginning.
Yeah.
How we actually get uranium out of the ground in the modern era.
Right. What's really striking when you look into this is how much uranium mining has changed. I mean, back in the mid-20th century, during the big push for military production.
The early days.
Exactly. We just didn't have the same understanding of radiation and its effects. And as a result, the protections for workers in uranium mines and mills were, well, minimal.
Really basic.
Pretty basic. The priority was getting as much uranium as possible, often without proper dust control or ventilation. And this unfortunately led to some very serious health issues for miners due to high exposure to things like radon gas.
It's hard to imagine those conditions. Radon,
Yeah.
that's the invisible, odorless gas that can increase the risk of cancer with long-term exposure, right?
That's the one.
To think people were working in those environments without knowing the dangers.
Precisely. But while those early practices were harmful, they also unfortunately provided a lot of data that has been crucial in shaping today's safety standards.
So we learned from those mistakes.
We did. Studies of those early miners have given us a much clearer picture of the risks, and this knowledge has directly led to the robust radiation protection measures we have in place now. Modern uranium mining is now a very different operation, with a huge emphasis on both worker safety and environmental protection.
And who's making sure these modern mines are operating by those high standards? It can't just be up to the mining companies themselves, can it?
No, not at all. Leading practice mines are heavily overseen by independent regulatory agencies.
Independent, okay.
These agencies are structured to report directly to government officials, which helps ensure that regulatory decisions aren't unduly influenced by political or economic pressures.
That makes sense.
Ideally, they operate with transparency, maintain clear records, and importantly, provide a process for anyone to voice concerns and be heard.
That sounds like a really important safeguard. So can you walk us through what a modern uranium mine looks like from start to finish? What are the main stages?
Sure. A modern uranium mine essentially goes through two main phases: production and rehabilitation.
Production and rehabilitation.
The production phase is when the active mining and milling take place to extract the uranium. This is when the most direct environmental and operational impacts occur. So this phase is characterized by active controls.
Active controls. Like what?
Think of things like keeping dust down, carefully managing water, and constantly monitoring conditions. Stuff like that.
Okay, so lots of active management while the mine is running. What happens once they've extracted all the viable uranium?
That's when the rehabilitation phase begins. This covers everything from the end of mining operations through to the actual closure of the mine, dismantling the facilities, and any necessary cleanup, which we call remediation.
Cleanup, right?
But it doesn't stop there. This phase also includes long-term monitoring to make sure the site is stable and performing as expected in the future.
For how long?
Can be a very long time. The focus shifts from those active controls during production to more passive controls, like specially designed covers for any waste materials or using natural processes for treating water. So it's a long-term commitment to ensuring safety.
It's definitely more involved than just closing the gates and walking away then.
Oh, absolutely.
You mentioned radiation protection being central. How is that specifically managed in these modern mines to keep workers safe?
Radiation protection is absolutely paramount. Now, while the specific radiation doses workers might receive can vary depending on the geology of the site,
Right, depends on the ore.
modern practices are designed to keep those exposures far below the limits set by regulations. One of our sources includes a graph that really illustrates this, showing that the average radiation doses for workers at a major site like Olympic Dam over 5 years are just a tiny fraction of the regulatory limit of 100 millisieverts.
Wow, okay, so much lower than the limit.
Much lower.
Oh,
And there's a constant drive for improvement in these safety measures.
that visual of the actual doses being so low compared to the limit is really reassuring. What about that radon gas we talked about earlier? How do modern mines protect against that?
Well, modern mines use sophisticated ventilation systems to constantly circulate fresh air and prevent radon gas from building up to dangerous levels.
Okay, lots of fresh air.
Exactly. They also employ dust control measures, as radon's decay products can attach to dust particles.
So dust control helps with radon too.
It does. And for the public, it's important to know that even historically, the radiation doses off-site from uranium mining and milling have been very low, typically just a small percentage of the natural background radiation we all encounter every day.
So minimal risk to nearby communities.
Studies have shown that radon levels near these facilities quickly return to normal background levels, often within the mine's property boundaries. Modern facilities add extra layers of protection for the public through physical barriers and those dust reduction practices, like carefully managing the areas where radon might be released and keeping any tailings damp to prevent dust from becoming airborne.
Water quality is another big concern people might have. Mining can potentially contaminate nearby water sources. What are the standards and practices for protecting water?
Yeah, protecting water quality is a top priority. Modern mines operate under very high environmental standards that are rigorously enforced by regulatory agencies.
Okay.
There are extensive monitoring programs in place, and importantly, there's often public engagement to address any water quality concerns that might arise.
So involving the public too.
Yes. Managing water, controlling the flow of water to, through, and away from the mine site is a significant undertaking, both in terms of cost and technical challenge.
I can imagine.
Any water that might be contaminated has to be treated to meet very strict standards before it can be released back into the environment.
I've heard about a different type of mining called in situ leach, or ISL. The report mentions it's becoming more common. How does that work, and what are the implications for water?
Yes, ISL. It accounted for a significant portion of global uranium production a decade ago, around 40%, and it's still growing, especially dominant in places like Kazakhstan.
How does it work?
It involves injecting a solution, a leaching solution, directly into the underground uranium ore body. This solution dissolves the uranium, and then the uranium-rich solution is pumped back to the surface for processing.
So no big open pits or tunnels?
Generally, no. A key advantage of ISL is that it has a lower upfront capital cost and can be used for lower-grade deposits. Plus, as you mentioned, it doesn't produce the large piles of waste rock or mill tailings that you get with conventional mining.
That sounds like it could be less environmentally damaging on the surface. But what about down below? How do they make sure that leaching solution doesn't contaminate groundwater outside the intended mining zone?
That's a really critical point, and it's managed very carefully. ISL operations are planned and conducted with multiple safety measures to protect groundwater.
Like what kind of measures?
For instance, at the Beverley ISL mine in Australia, they use specially designed wellheads with systems to catch any leaks, and they have online detectors to continuously monitor the solutions being pumped.
Real-time monitoring, okay.
They also typically use evaporation ponds to manage the extracted solutions, and these ponds have leak detection systems built in. And crucially, before any ISL project can go ahead, there's a very thorough environmental impact assessment.
Assessment first.
Yes, including testing to show that the uranium extraction is contained within a defined area, often monitored with wells around the perimeter of the mining zone. And ongoing environmental monitoring provides an extra layer of assurance throughout the operation.
Okay, that sounds pretty comprehensive. What about the waste material from conventional uranium mining, the tailings? You mentioned ISL doesn't produce much, but conventional mining does. How are those dealt with in modern mines?
Right. For conventional mines, the leading practice for managing tailings focuses on isolating them from the environment for the long term.
Isolation is key.
Absolutely. This usually involves placing them in specially engineered disposal facilities designed to contain them securely, or sometimes in old, mined-out open pits that have been engineered specifically for this purpose.
Using old pits, is that safe?
It can be. Using open pits can actually offer some long-term physical stability advantages and might require less ongoing maintenance compared to above-ground engineered structures. The images we have showing the Cluff Lake tailings area in Canada before and after it was decommissioned really illustrate this.
Oh, yeah. What do they show?
You see the area being reshaped, covered with natural materials like glacial till, and then replanted. It's designed to minimize any potential for environmental harm in the long run.
It's good to see that visual of land being restored. It definitely contrasts sharply with the historical example you mentioned earlier, the Schlema waste piles in Germany that had such devastating consequences.
It does. It's a relief to hear that lessons have been learned, and even that Schlema area was eventually cleaned up and rehabilitated, becoming Bad Schlema, a spot town.
Right.
And a crucial part of that learning has been the implementation of comprehensive environmental monitoring programs throughout the entire lifespan of a mine.
Continuous checks.
Exactly. This allows operators and regulators to track any potential impacts and verify that the mine is performing according to the set environmental targets. This is a huge difference from the early days of mining, where the lack of monitoring led to widespread contamination that was often very difficult and expensive to remediate later on.
Another important safeguard mentioned is financial assurance. What exactly does that mean in the context of a uranium mine?
Financial assurance is a really important leading practice. Basically, it ensures mining companies, not the public or governments, are financially responsible for the costs of closing the mine and cleaning up the site.
So the company pays for the cleanup.
Yes. Companies are now required to put up financial guarantees, essentially, setting aside money, maybe through bonds or escrow accounts, to cover these future costs. This means they have to have an approved plan for closure and remediation in place before they even start production.
Wow, before they even start digging.
That's the idea. It's a significant improvement from the past, where governments often ended up footing the bill for abandoned mines, leaving taxpayers with the cleanup costs.
So planning for the very end of the mine's life is now something that happens right at the beginning.
Exactly. It's an integral part of the entire mine life cycle, from developing the decommissioning plans to securing the financial assurance.
What happens after the company finishes the cleanup?
Once the company has completed the decommissioning work and the site is deemed stable according to the approved plan, there's often a period of transition phase monitoring to ensure everything is performing as expected. Ultimately, the long-term responsibility for the site can sometimes be transferred to the government, but only after the company has met all the agreed-upon requirements.
Finally, the report touches on the safe transport of uranium, or concentrates, or UOC. That sounds like it could be a potential risk. How is that handled?
Safe transport is definitely a critical consideration. The movement of all hazardous materials, including those used in mining like acids and fuels, and the uranium or concentrates themselves, is strictly regulated by national and international authorities.
Okay, strong regulations.
Yes. Interestingly, because uranium has relatively low radioactivity per unit of mass, UOC is actually classified as a low hazard for transportation purposes from a radiological perspective.
Oh, really? Lower than you might think.
Yeah. It's typically shipped in sealed steel drums inside standard ISO shipping containers with all the necessary safety labeling. The primary hazard concern during transport is actually its chemical toxicity as a heavy metal rather than its radioactivity.
Ah, okay, so it's treated more like other hazardous industrial chemicals in transport.
In many ways, yes. Strict handling procedures are still essential, of course.
So to sum up this first part, it sounds like modern uranium mining is a highly regulated and significantly safer industry than it was historically. Is that fair?
I think that's fair to say. There's a major focus on protecting workers, the environment, and the public throughout the entire life cycle of the mine. And that includes planning and paying for closure right from the start.
Okay.
Precisely. The advancements in mining techniques like ISL, combined with stringent regulatory oversight, comprehensive environmental monitoring, and the requirement for financial assurance, all aim to make uranium production efficient and safe with a limited and carefully managed environmental footprint. And of course, thorough worker training and well-ventilated workplaces are fundamental.
Right. So now that we have a better understanding of where the uranium comes from, maybe let's move on to the next stages in the nuclear fuel cycle and see what happens to it after it leaves the mine.
Okay, sounds good. So the uranium is out of the ground, possibly as UOC. What's the next step in turning it into fuel that can actually be used in a nuclear reactor to generate power?
Right. The uranium ore concentrate needs further processing to get it ready for use as fuel. The initial product recovered from refining the uranium at the mill is often called yellowcake.
Yellow cake, yeah, heard that term.
As the name suggests, it's often a bright yellow powder, and it's mostly a compound called ammonium diurnate, or sometimes sodium diurnate. This yellowcake then goes through additional purification and processing to convert it into a more stable form of uranium oxide, either U3O8 or UO2, which is the nuclear-grade material ready for the next steps.
U3O8 or UO2. Okay.
And interestingly, a similar process is used to produce thorium oxide, THO2, as thorium is another element that can be used as a nuclear fuel in some reactor designs. Yellowcake, it's definitely a memorable term. So from this yellow powder, how do we actually get to the fuel rods or whatever form it takes to eventually go into a nuclear reactor?
Okay, well, if the uranium is intended for use in most commercial power reactors, like the light water reactors common today, it needs to undergo a process called enrichment.
Enrichment. Why?
This means increasing the concentration of the specific isotope of uranium that is easily fissionable, which is uranium-235. Natural uranium only has about 0.7 per 7 per Cu-235.
Oh, tiny amount.
Very small. Most reactors need more, typically 3–5%. So to enrich it, the yellowcake, or the natural uranium oxide derived from it, is first converted into a compound called uranium hexafluoride, or UF6, at a conversion plant.
UF6, hexafluoride.
Yep. This conversion process typically uses hydrogen fluoride. The key reason for converting it to UF6 is that it becomes a gas at relatively moderate temperatures and pressures, which is necessary for the enrichment process itself.
Ah, it needs to be a gas for enrichment. Got it.
Right.
And this enrichment process, how does that actually work to increase the amount of uranium-235?
Uranium enrichment takes place at specialized enrichment plants. It involves increasing the proportion of the U-235 isotope relative to the much more common U-238 isotope.
How do they separate them? They're almost identical.
They are very close in mass, which makes it difficult. The two main methods used today are based on gaseous diffusion and gas centrifugation. Both methods take advantage of that very slight difference in mass between the U-238 and U-235 isotopes within the UF6 molecules.
Yeah.
Think of it a bit like trying to separate lighter and heavier grains of sand by shaking them. The slightly lighter ones will tend to move a bit differently. Centrifuge technology, which spins the gaseous UF6 at incredibly high speeds in cylinders.
Super fast spinning.
Extremely fast. This process is now the more energy efficient and widely used method. Imagine spinning different sized balls in a ducket. The slightly heavier ones will be pushed a tiny bit further to the outside wall.
Right.
It's a very subtle separation that has to be repeated many, many times in cascades of centrifuges to get the desired enrichment level.
The report mentions different levels of enrichment, LEU and HEU. What's the distinction there?
Good question. That refers to the percentage of uranium-235 in the enriched uranium. As I said, natural uranium contains only about 0.7 per Sevi U-235.
Right.
Low enriched uranium, or LEU, which is used in the vast majority of commercial nuclear power plants around the world, has a U-235 concentration somewhere between that 0.7% and up to 20%. Usually it's in the 3–5% range for power reactors.
Okay, LEU for power plants. What about HEU?
High enriched uranium, or HEU, has a concentration greater than 20% U-235. It's typically used in naval nuclear propulsion systems, like submarines and aircraft carriers, and also in some specific types of research reactors, and historically it was used for nuclear weapons.
That makes sense. Different applications requiring different fuel specifications. The report also briefly mentions enriched lithium being needed for some molten salt reactor technologies. Why is that a requirement?
Right, that's specific to certain designs of molten salt reactors, or MSRs. Some of these use a lithium fluoride salt, often mixed with other fluoride salts as part of their fuel or coolant mixture.
Okay.
Natural lithium is made up of two stable isotopes, lithium-6 and lithium-7. The issue is that when lithium-6 atoms absorb a neutron in the reactor, they can produce tritium, which is a radioactive isotope of hydrogen and can be a safety and handling challenge.
So you want to avoid making tritium if possible.
Exactly, in these specific MSR designs. To minimize the production of tritium, the lithium used is enriched in the lithium-7 isotope, as lithium-7 is much less likely to undergo that reaction when it absorbs a neutron. For example, the molten salt reactor experiment that ran at Oak Ridge National Laboratory back in the 60s used lithium that was very highly enriched, over 99.9% in lithium-7.
Interesting detail. Okay, so we've gone from mining the uranium to processing it into yellowcake, converting it to UF6, enriching it. And even seeing how other elements like lithium can be part of the fuel cycle for different reactor types.
Mm,
What happens once the enriched uranium is actually used in a reactor? We end up with what's called spent nuclear fuel.
yeah.
What's the story with that?
Right. So when nuclear fuel undergoes fission in a reactor to produce heat and ultimately electricity, it doesn't just disappear.
No, it changes.
It changes significantly. Fission releases energy, but it also creates a variety of fission products. These are essentially the smaller atoms that are formed when a uranium or plutonium atom splits. Think things like strontium-90, cesium-137, highly radioactive isotopes.
Waste products.
Largely, yes. But it also produces what we call transmutation products, which are other radioactive isotopes, often heavier elements called actinides, that are created when neutrons are captured by atoms in the fuel without causing fission. Plutonium is a key example here. Additionally, the fuel assemblies themselves can contain other materials, like burnable poisons or neutron absorbers, which are elements added deliberately to help control the chain reaction within the reactor core as the fuel is used up. These can also affect what's in the spent fuel and how it might be treated later.
And what's the fate of this spent nuclear fuel? Is it simply stored away, or can it be processed further in some way?
Well, that's a major topic in nuclear energy. Spent nuclear fuel still contains valuable materials. It has some of the original fissile uranium-235 that didn't fission, fertile uranium-238 that didn't transmute, and quite a bit of plutonium, which is also fissile and can be used as fuel.
So it's not entirely waste.
Not at all. From a resource perspective, it also contains those fission products, which are the main source of the high radioactivity and are generally considered waste, along with some other minor actinides. Nuclear fuel reprocessing is a process that involves chemically separating these different materials.
Why reprocessed?
The goal is usually to recover the valuable elements like unused uranium, plutonium, and sometimes even those minor actinides, while separating out the waste fission products for dedicated disposal. The specific objectives of reprocessing depend heavily on the overall strategy for the nuclear fuel cycle, things like resource utilization, waste management goals, and non-proliferation concerns.
The report mentions both aqueous-based and non-aqueous reprocessing technologies. What are the main differences between these approaches?
Right. Aqueous-based reprocessing is the more established method. The PURX process plutonium-uranium reduction extraction is the most well-known example.
PRX, okay.
It's a mature technology that has been used for many decades for both military plutonium production and commercial spent fuel reprocessing in some countries. It basically involves dissolving the spent fuel in strong nitric acid and then using organic solvents in a series of steps to selectively extract the uranium and plutonium.
Okay, sounds like complex chemistry.
It is. Non-aqueous reprocessing technologies, on the other hand, are generally less mature, but are being actively researched and developed, often called pyroprocessing.
Pyro, like fire.
Exactly. They often operate at much higher temperatures. These methods can involve processes like electrorefining in molten salts or using molten metals.
What are the potential advantages?
One potential advantage is that they might be able to directly produce metallic forms of the recovered actinides, which could be suitable for certain types of advanced reactors like fast reactors. They might also be better suited for processing fuels that are still very radioactive and generating a lot of heat shortly after coming out of the reactor, potentially reducing the need for long cooling times.
It sounds like there's a real variety of nuclear fuel types used in different kinds of reactors, too. The report mentions ceramic, metallic, and halide salt fuels. Can you give us a few examples of where these are used?
Absolutely. The diversity is quite broad. The most common type of nuclear reactor globally, the light water reactor, LWR, typically uses ceramic fuel.
Ceramic. Like pottery.
Sort of, but much higher tech. Specifically, it's pellets of low-enriched uranium dioxide, UO2, a ceramic material that are stacked inside long metal tubes, usually made of a zirconium alloy, forming fuel rods. Mixed oxide fuel, or MOX fuel, which is a mixture of plutonium and uranium oxides, is another example of a ceramic fuel used in some LWRs and breeder reactors.
Okay. What about metallic fuels?
Metallic fuels, which are often alloys of uranium with other metals like zirconium or molybdenum, have been used in some research reactors and were key in the development of fast breeder reactors, like the EBR-2 reactor in the U.S. They have advantages in terms of thermal conductivity.
And the halide salts.
And then, as we touched on earlier with the lithium enrichment, halide salt fuels like the fluoride or chloride salts containing dissolved uranium or thorium are the concept behind molten salt reactors. The fuel is the molten salt mixture, which can also act as the coolant.
Wow.
The report even includes images of different fuel element designs, which really highlights this diversity. You see the chunky fuel elements for the old Magna-X reactors, the long assemblies for Hanford's N reactor, the hexagonal bundles for EBR-2, flat plate type fuel common in research reactors, and even the tiny coated trizo fuel particles designed for high-temperature gas-cooled reactors.
Triso particles, like tiny encapsulated fuel balls.
Exactly. Each one is like a miniature, self-contained fuel element designed to hold fission products even at very high temperatures.
So it really seems like the choice of reprocessing technology, if it's used at all, is very specific to the type of fuel that was used and the overall goals for managing that used fuel.
Exactly right. It's a highly application-specific decision that takes into account a whole range of factors: technical feasibility, economic costs, societal considerations, waste management strategies, and even government policy and non-proliferation objectives. There's no single best approach.
Now, let's maybe turn our attention to the uranium supply chain here in the U.S., as outlined in that GAO report. What are some of the key takeaways from that?
Yeah, the GAO report points out some significant shifts and, frankly, challenges that have occurred in the U.S. uranium supply chain. While the U.S. was once a world leader in producing enriched uranium for its reactors.
Right, we used to do it all domestically.
Pretty much. But domestic production has declined considerably over the past few decades. The last commercially operating enrichment plant in the U.S. that used American-developed gaseous diffusion technology actually ceased enrichment operations back in 2013. That was the plant in Paducah, Kentucky.
So no U.S. tech enrichment commercially now.
Currently, the only operating commercial-scale uranium enrichment facility in the United States is Louisiana Energy Services, or LES, down in Eunice, New Mexico. It's owned by Urenco, which is a European consortium, and it uses European gas centrifuge technology.
Okay.
And importantly, it primarily produces what is known as obligated enriched uranium.
What exactly does obligated uranium mean in this context? What's the obligation?
Good question. Obligated uranium generally refers to nuclear material that is subject to certain peaceful use commitments or restrictions based on international agreements or contracts tied to its origin or how it was processed. For example, if the original natural uranium came from Australia, its use might be tracked and restricted under agreements between the U.S. and Australia.
Okay, so there are strings attached. Why is unobligated uranium important then?
The GAO report highlights that unobligated uranium material free from these kinds of restrictions is really important for certain specific U.S. government purposes,
Like what?
particularly for national defense missions managed by the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA. This includes maintaining the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile, fueling the Navy's nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers, the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, producing tritium, which is essential for modern nuclear weapons, and also increasingly for supplying high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HALEU.
HALEU, what's that used for?
HAU has enrichment levels between 5% and 20% U-235, higher than standard LEU. It's needed for many advanced reactor designs currently under development, and also for producing some critical medical isotopes and fueling certain research reactors. And the U.S. currently has very limited capacity to produce HAU, especially from unobligated sources.
So the U.S. relies on these obligated sources, often foreign enriched, for most commercial reactors, but has these distinct requirements for unobligated uranium for national security and future energy needs. How is the U.S. currently addressing these needs for unobligated uranium?
Well, the NNSA has been focused on carefully managing and preserving its existing inventories of unobligated uranium, particularly HEU. A key priority for them now is to reestablish a domestic capability to enrich uranium specifically for these unobligated needs, particularly producing LEU for tritium production, which is a vital defense mission.
Rebuilding domestic capability.
Yes. They are currently undertaking a detailed analysis to determine the best technology and approach to achieve this. Separately, the Department of Energy, or DOE, has also proposed creating a strategic domestic uranium reserve.
A reserve, what would that do?
The idea is to purchase domestically mined and converted uranium to provide support for the front end of the U.S. fuel cycle, the miners and converters. They believe this would also have a beneficial knock-on effect on the supply of unobligated uranium feed material for future enrichment needs.
It sounds like there are a lot of different government agencies involved in this NNS. DOE, you mentioned the Navy, probably Commerce and State, too. Is there good coordination between all of them on these important issues?
That's actually a point the GAO report raises some concerns about. They looked at the level of planning and coordination among agencies like NNSA and DOE regarding the future of uranium enrichment capabilities.
What did they find?
While a government body called the Nuclear Fuel Working Group did develop a strategy back in 2020 to address potential risks to the domestic uranium industry, the GAO found that this strategy wasn't fully aligned with what they consider the key characteristics of a comprehensive national strategy,
How so?
particularly in terms of clearly defining resources, investments needed, timelines, and the specific roles and responsibilities of the different organizations involved. They point out a potential issue, for example, where DOE's funding of a large-scale demonstration project for a specific U.S. centrifuge technology could potentially complicate NNSA's separate, independent analysis of different technology options needed for its future defense missions.
So they might be working at cross purposes, or at least not optimally coordinating investments.
That's the concern GAO raised the need for better integration and strategic alignment.
The GAO report also mentions the idea of a nuclear industrial base advisory committee. What would be the purpose of such a committee?
Right. The Nuclear Fuel Working Group's strategy proposed the creation of a U.S. nuclear industrial base concept, kind of drawing a parallel to how the Department of Defense thinks about its defense industrial base.
Okay.
The idea behind an advisory committee would be to foster better communication and collaboration between the government agencies involved and the private sector companies that make up the domestic uranium mining, conversion, enrichment, and fuel fabrication industries.
Getting everyone talking to each other more effectively.
Essentially, yes. The aim is perhaps to learn from the experiences of other countries that seem to have more integrated national strategies for supporting their nuclear industries.
So it's really about making sure there's a strong and reliable domestic supply chain for uranium, not just for commercial nuclear power, but also for these crucial national security needs. And the GAO is suggesting that better planning and coordination between government agencies is needed to make that happen effectively.
Precisely. There are inherent complexities when multiple agencies with different missions and budgets are involved, and the GAO is highlighting the need for a more cohesive and strategically aligned national approach to ensure the U.S. has the capabilities it needs for the future.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into a topic that can often feel quite mysterious, maybe even a bit intimidating to those outside the field.
It covers a lot of ground, for sure.
Yeah. For someone who's just tuning in and trying to grasp the essentials, what would you say are the most important things to remember about where nuclear fuel comes from and how it's prepared?
Okay, for someone just getting familiar with the nuclear fuel cycle, I think the key things to understand are, first, modern uranium mining is a sophisticated process with a really strong emphasis now on safety and environmental responsibility. It's a significant evolution from historical practices.
I think mining's changed a lot.
Second, the uranium extracted then undergoes several crucial processing steps, going from ore concentrate or yellow cake to conversion into a gas, UF6, and then enrichment to increase the U-235 level to become the fuel actually used in most nuclear reactors.
Multiple steps after mining.
And finally, the U.S. uranium supply chain is, well, a complex area involving both commercial activities and critical national security considerations, with ongoing efforts and debate about how best to ensure a secure and reliable domestic supply for the future.
That's a really helpful summary. Captures the key stages and issues well.
Glad it helps.
Now, as we wrap up our discussion, here's something to think about for you listening.
Yeah.
Considering the very long operational lives of nuclear power plants, often 60 or even 80 years, and the continuous advancements being made in reactor technologies, like those advanced reactors needing HALEU, what do you anticipate will be the most significant challenges and maybe opportunities for the uranium fuel cycle in the coming decades? Or perhaps, now that you have a foundational understanding of these initial stages, the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle, what specific aspect of nuclear energy production, maybe waste management, reactor operation, or fusion energy, are you now most curious to learn more about?
Those are really important questions that underscore the ongoing evolution and, frankly, the crucial nature of this field as we look towards future energy needs and climate goals.
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's provided you with a clear understanding of the fascinating and vital journey of nuclear fuel.